Our last speaker is Mike Russo. Mike is his regular job is as he's the division lead for the external programs at SEAC, the Southeast Archaeological Center. But we're absolutely delighted to have him in Washington, serving as the Erica Seibert stand-in. He's our National Register NHL archaeologist and has done that for a couple months now, I guess, and will be there maybe another month. He's added significantly to our knowledge while he's been with us in Washington. He's got a PhD in archaeology from the University of Florida. He also worked in the state of Louisiana as a regional archaeologist, but he's been with NPS now for 20 years. So, Mike, thank you so much.
Is this the button? Okay. Thanks. As Barbara mentioned, I'm the acting archaeologist. It seems that the National Register program runs out of archaeologists frequently, and they bring somebody in. There is I would suggest, a chronic underrepresentation of archaeology in the National Register, not from any lack of trying, but from just the way it's been set up. It's traditionally been dominated by historians. And I think the ratio now is like 13-1, and that one guy is acting only. So my expertise on these topics I'm going to talk about, and they're all policy topics, and what the National Register represents in terms of landscape guidance. When I first got there, Barbara asked me to discuss, if I would, the archaeological aspects of landscape guidance and how our guidance guides people, and is it good, bad, what are the high and low spots of it. So that's what I've done. I've reviewed all the bulletins, and you're all familiar with the bulletins, and all the bulletins I've reviewed are out on the docket outside there, and please make yourself available to those. And I've concluded this. There are virtually no National Register guidelines specific to maritime cultural landscapes, and certainly none specific to archaeological MCLs. Given Paul's earlier suggestion that the register by law and design recognizes only 5 property types, and that the landscape is not considered a property type, it probably comes as no surprise then that the limited register guidance on specific types of landscapes, in fact, may be understandable. That is, there is also no register-specific guidance on how to nominate a 19th century road, or a 20th century subway track, or a turpentine camp, a roller coaster, or a human versus animal migration trail, although all of these have been listed or are eligible for listing on the National Register. This is because the National Register's guidance is purposely general in character to accommodate virtually any historically significant place in America. Let's see if this works. That being said, there are places so unusual, so different from properties first envisioned by the National Register program, that those places have engendered separate guidelines specific to those resource types, such as mines, ships, navigational aids, and battlefields. And of course, landscapes represent another. There are, in fact, 2 specific National Register guidelines on landscapes. The first being National Register Bulletin 18, published in 1981, some 15 years after the establishment of the register itself, and it dealt with designed urban landscapes whose contributing elements were primarily included buildings and structures, but also open designed lands such as parks and gardens. The bulletin still serves well the nomination of historic urban landscape features to the register, but the word archaeology, and I'm talking here about archaeological landscapes, is mentioned only twice in the 14-page document. And those mentions do not discuss at all how to integrate archaeological resources into nominations for standing historic properties, usually nominated under Criterion C for period, masterwork, or artistic distinction. In 1990, Bulletin 30 on rural historic landscapes was released. It provided guidance on nominating all other non-urban landscapes, including, as examples, a couple maritime landscape themes, fishing and shipping, distinguishing urban from rural landscapes primarily by the differences in the ratio of the built environment that consisted of buildings and structures such as ranches, fences, and roads, from the natural environment consisting of landforms and vegetation cover, including forests, brush, and modified lands such as farm fields. As long as people had worked in, manipulated, or otherwise affected the natural environmental features in some historically significant way, rural landscapes were seen as potentially eligible for the register. Under Bulletin 30, natural features could not be seen as part of the rural landscape unless they had, quote, reflected the day-to-day occupational activities of people engaged in traditional work, who have developed and evolved the natural features in response to both the forces of nature and the pragmatic need to make a living. That is, the historic significance of a rural historic landscape in the view of the NR under Bulletin 30 was that it reflects people's adaptations to the natural environment. In archaeological parlance, a predominantly processual view. For archaeology, Bulletin 30 was far more substantial than Bulletin 18 had been. It mentioned archaeological sites 19 times, stressing their potential as landscape features akin to buildings and structures when observable in such things as relic house foundations, stone fences, or dirt roads. Calling such an approach a landscape archaeological approach, however, buried observable archaeological deposits were not identified in any of the many examples as holding the potential to constitute a landscape in their own right, without the presence of man-made vegetation or natural features above the ground. Surface meeting criterion C requirements of aesthetic or emblematic work of a period or master builder. That is, no clear definition as to what may or may not constitute a criterion D archaeological landscape or its features was presented. In fact, the term archaeological landscape was never used in NR 30 or in any other National Register guidance. Why, we ask? One part of the answer may be found in Bulletin 36. I think that's Bulletin 36, yes. Guidelines for evaluating and registering archaeological properties. It states that under criterion A, B, and C, the National Register must place a heavy emphasis on the property looking like it did during the period of significance. That is, landscapes from the typical NR perspectives are typically viewable entities preserved in time. And I think our early discussions on showing what a landscape looks like kind of reinforces that idea. Few, if any, are constituted solely of unobservable stains or artifacts buried underground that need technical interpretations to reckon their historical significance, let alone determine what landscape they used to be on. Thousands of archaeological sites are listed under criterion D strictly for their informational potential, but when the aesthetic and visual aspects expected of a landscape meet these hidden resources, landscapes discussions disappear. Like previous bulletin, 36 presented no clean definition of or guidelines for dealing with strictly archaeological landscapes that lacked above-ground features. But the bulletin did present one example of an archaeological landscape with no apparent above-ground presence of its archaeology. But again, as you see in this case, surface vegetation reflected the historic period of interest provided the aesthetic requirement under criterion C, and that's why it is nominated as a landscape. The major goal of archaeology, according to Bulletin 36, was to understand the effects of environmental change and population pressure and the impact of human action on the landscape, a concept directly linked to Bulletin 20's concept of Bulletin 30's concept of rural historic landscapes. In Bulletin 21, there is also some information, although the title wouldn't suggest that that's got probably more information on landscapes than all but the rural archaeological landscapes than all but the rural historic bulletin. And I'd recommend reading that if you want to get some interesting ideas on how to bound archaeological landscapes. But in this, no definition of landscapes is presented either. It does offer examples of landscapes as bounded sites and districts, some of which contain archaeological deposits. Again, however, all landscapes with archaeological features are considered landscapes only under criterion C, that is, for their standing structures and or visible natural features. Like 21, Bulletin 2020 sees archaeology primarily as a handmade into historic structures, and in terms of landscapes, archaeology is not mentioned without them or without aesthetic natural features present. In the section concerning In the section concerning the bounding of registered properties in general, 6 out of 17 are described as landscapes or as containing landscape features, including archaeological sites with no surface expressions whatsoever. But when the reader turns to the section entitled Boundaries for Archaeological Sites and Districts, wherein criterion D is the primary criterion of significance, none of the sites or districts are viewed as landscapes or landscape features, despite the fact that both environmental and cultural data that could constitute a rural historic landscape are present but buried and hidden. In one example, archaeological components are explicitly excluded from landscape feature recognition, while at the same time natural features are identified as landscape components. I suspect they are hidden. If we take a look at the dictionary definition of landscape, the visual aspect is of course critical. But given the registered description of a rural landscape as a sealed archaeological landscape is a real possibility, despite the fact that none are identified in guidance documents. In the end, I suspect that the fact that no buried archaeological sites or districts have ever been identified as landscapes in the NR owes as much to the fact that the register simply does not track landscapes as a property type as much as it has to do with the individual tendencies for us to think of landscapes only when surface and observable cultural and natural features are present. This brings me finally to the question as to how to nominate archaeological maritime landscapes if all contributing elements are buried underground or in deep or murky waters according to NR criteria. Do landscapes need a visible structure or building in order to be listed, or can completely buried archaeological sites completely buried archaeological sites with no surface expression as landscape features constitute a landscape in and of themselves? Technically, no register guidance requires observability as a criterion for contributing to a landscape district. But in practice, no district exists that has been identified as a landscape that lacks visible features. This leaves open the question of purely buried archaeological landscapes under the register. Though most archaeologists could easily identify cultural landscapes through other approaches, and do through other approaches, including catchment, settlement, nearest neighbor, other spatially oriented analyses involving archaeological and environmental data. As for observable shipwrecks, Bulletin 20 nominating historic vessels and shipwrecks to the National Register provides a good overview of the unique problems inherent in locating and describing shipwrecks for the register, although it doesn't specifically talk about landscapes. It notes that for register review purposes, wrecks and wreck elements are always seen as archaeological sites, even though on a comparative level it is hypothesized that the best preserved among them might easily be classified as structures under criterion C. On the surface, recognizing some wrecks as structures rather than archaeological sites would solve many problems concerning buried archaeological landscapes, or at least underwater landscapes that have observable features, but lots of buried archaeological features also. But if the register were to do so, to recognize these as structures rather than as archaeological sites, other problems would arise. For one, a higher degree of integrity is required for structures than for archaeological sites. Nonetheless, and despite some of the NR guidance to the contrary, isolated shipwrecks have been listed under criterion D for the information potential, as well as a criterion C for aesthetic or masterwork aspects. Why? As Bulletin notes, the application of National Register criteria to shipwrecks has not been well defined or understood. I think clarifying when and how shipwrecks should be classified as structures and not archaeological sites will be critical to any attempt at involving them as contributing elements in maritime landscapes districts. In the end, the largest issue for the register involving submerged landscapes will not be shipwrecks or drowned former terrestrial sites themselves, however, but rather how we connect them to the land. Under the NR, the current NR regulations, both the land and the cultural resources constitute the landscape, but under rural historic landscapes criteria, perhaps the closest we have under which we could nominate a maritime cultural landscape. People or cultures are required to have worked or shaped or modified the land in order for it to be considered part of an historic landscape. I think John Jensen brought up this problem earlier on how to define boundaries. In the case of shipwrecks, with few exceptions, however, most historic and prehistoric sailors or passengers did not work the ocean bottom. The working life of the vessel was typically restricted to its time as a floating entity, not its brief tenure as a sinking or sunk one. What land, if any, becomes part of that natural landscape aspect of a shipwreck landscape? That is, the guidance suggests that ocean, lakes, or river bottoms are not part of the archaeological sites unless physical remains of the ships or its wrecking event can be found. If this idea is extended to shipwreck landscapes, this could be problematic. How do we get the greater natural features involved in defining shipwrecks and drowned site cultural landscapes? I think that's the question that I'm looking for this symposium to answer. Thank you.